It's funny, or maybe just cruelly ironic, how you can live side by side with someone for years and still not know them at all. That was Grace for me. To everyone else, we were the perfect couple. They'd look at us how I used to look at us and think we had it all together. We lived in this picture-perfect house on a quiet street just outside the city, with the lawn mowed, the hedges trimmed, and the usual decorations for every season. I thought we were a team, partners in this life we'd built together. But I guess she had other ideas. In the beginning, everything felt right. We'd been married 5 years, and we had what people call a good life. I was pulling in a nice income in finance, which meant Grace didn't need to worry about work for money. She worked in charity, something she'd always been passionate about. I'd be out of town now and then, but whenever I was home, we made a point to spend time together. We traveled a lot, went out on date nights, did everything that I thought kept a relationship strong. But looking back, I wonder if it was all just a show, for me or maybe even for herself. The first time I felt something was off, it was small, a missed call, maybe, or an unanswered text. It wasn't like her to be so secretive, not with me. I tried to brush it off. After all, we're adults, not teenagers who need to be attached at the hip. But as time went on, the changes in her behavior kept piling up like this creeping feeling that I couldn't shake. She started going out more, often in the evenings, which wasn't like her. I'd ask her casually at first, "Where are you headed?" And she'd brush me off with a work meeting or just seeing friends. Friends I'd never heard of, and meetings that didn't seem to have any set schedule. When I'd push a bit more, she'd give me the usual lines, "I'm busy with work," or "just trying to get some time to myself." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she just needed space. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home late. I don't remember what was going on with me that day, just that I wanted to crawl into bed and pass out. Grace was already asleep, her phone lying face down on the nightstand. Normally, I'd never touch her phone. It's personal, right? But that night, something in me felt different, like I couldn't ignore this nagging suspicion anymore. So, while she slept, I reached over and picked it up. There was a message on her lock screen, just a single line, and it felt like my heart dropped when I read it. "Your wife is cheating on you. It's someone close to you." No sender name, no other context, just that brutal sentence. I read it again, trying to wrap my head around it. Who would send something like this? It felt too direct, too personal to be some random prank. And why would anyone close to us want to hurt me like that? For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process. A part of me wanted to wake her up, shake her out of bed, demand she explain herself. But I didn't. Instead, I just locked her phone and put it back exactly where I found it, then lay there in the dark, pretending I didn't know anything. But of course, from that moment on, I couldn't look at her the same way. My mind kept going back to that message. Every little thing she did that was even slightly suspicious became another reason to doubt her. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but I could barely get through breakfast without staring at her, wondering if she knew, wondering if she'd admit anything. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, so I asked her directly, "Grace, who sent you a message last night? Someone saying you're cheating on me?" Her reaction was almost convincing. She looked shocked, wide-eyed, and then started laughing, though it sounded forced, shaky. "Are you serious?" she said, barely meeting my eyes. "That's ridiculous. Probably just one of my friends playing a prank. I have no idea who'd even send that. Come on, Jackson. You don't believe this, right?" I didn't respond. I just kept watching her, and for a second, I thought I saw something flicker in her expression, something that wasn't just amusement or disbelief. Maybe fear? I don't know, but it was enough to set off alarms in my head. I wanted to trust her. I really did. But the more she talked, trying to brush it off, the more I felt like she was hiding something. I managed to keep my cool, though, telling her, if it was a joke, it was a pretty cruel one. She just nodded, giving me that fake, reassuring smile she'd been using a lot lately. Over the next few days, I tried to let it go, but every time she left the house, that damn message played on a loop in my head. I was seeing ghosts in everything she did. The way she'd leave her phone lying around, but suddenly start locking it. Or the time she'd head out without saying where she was going. The way she'd close herself off when I asked about her day, like there was some part of her life I wasn't allowed into. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to find out the truth, even if it meant tearing apart the life we'd built together. I reached out to an investigator I knew, Tom. He'd helped me with some business stuff in the past, and I trusted him. When I called, I tried to sound calm, but I could tell he knew something was wrong. "Tom," I said, my voice shaky, "I need you to look into someone for me." The words felt like sandpaper in my mouth, admitting that I didn't trust my own wife. Tom didn't ask questions, just said he'd take care of it. I hung up, staring at my phone, wondering if I'd just opened a door I'd never be able to close. It didn't take long for Tom to get started. Within a couple of days, he was sending me brief, dry updates on what he'd seen. At first, nothing was out of the ordinary. Grace was going to work, meeting friends, attending yoga. She was doing everything like clockwork, as if she knew someone was watching. But I knew Tom was good. He'd keep digging until he found something, if there was anything to find. The days ticked by with no red flags. Every night, I'd wait for Tom's text, heart hammering, hoping for answers and dreading them at the same time. Finally, after almost a week, Tom told me she'd been spending a lot of time with one of her colleagues, a senior manager at her charity organization named Martin. I'd met Martin once, maybe twice, and didn't think much of him back then. Just another guy in Grace's circle, the type she'd always had around her. But now, hearing his name again, my gut twisted. Tom kept watch on her, following her to her office, to lunch, even to a few late work nights that she'd been having lately. One evening, he told me she'd left work with Martin. They walked side by side, laughing, like they shared a joke no one else would understand. Tom followed them to a quiet restaurant, where they sat close, leaning in, faces lit up. He said the way they looked at each other didn't seem like just a friendship. Later that night, Tom watched as they left the restaurant together, got into Martin's car, and drove off in the direction of my house. My house. I kept imagining them there, in the place I'd built for her and me, our home. The idea of him, a stranger, sharing those moments in my space, made my skin crawl. I wanted to confront her right then, to storm in and demand she explain herself, but something told me to hold off. It felt too obvious, too easy. I'd seen her cover her tracks before. She'd find a way to turn this back on me, or convince me it was all a misunderstanding. And I'd probably believe her, like I had so many times before. No, I needed something undeniable. Tom kept digging, trailing her for another few days. Grace kept up a routine, but every now and then, she'd meet Martin. I'd get Tom's updates, watch them get closer, but something felt off. It was too neat, too obvious. Like she was setting herself up to be seen with Martin, as if she wanted me or anyone who might be watching to catch on to them. It was a strange feeling, and I was about to bring it up to Tom when his updates took a turn. A few days later, Tom called me directly. His voice was steadier than mine, but I could tell even he was shaken. He told me he'd seen Grace with someone else. Not Martin. It was my father, Henry. At first, I couldn't even understand what he was saying. My father? The man who'd always been there. The man who'd raised me. Who taught me everything I know about being a man. The guy who'd called Grace his perfect daughter-in-law. Tom tried to soften it, to give me a warning, but nothing could have prepared me for what he was saying. He explained he'd been tracking her one night when she met my father at a small bar outside of town. They didn't sit in the open. Instead, they found a dark corner and huddled close, as if they were sharing secrets. Tom said they looked far too comfortable with each other, the kind of closeness that goes beyond family. I didn't want to believe it, and I told Tom to keep following them. This had to be a mistake. They'd been spending time together because what? There had to be some innocent reason. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth was sitting in my gut, gnawing at me. Tom stayed on them for the next few days, but I felt like I was the one being watched. Every night, he'd text or call with updates. It was like I was being fed a poison, drop by drop. Finally, Tom told me he'd followed them to a hotel. They'd arrived separately, my father and my wife, but they went in together, hand in hand. I kept thinking, this can't be real. But Tom, the cold professional, sent me video clips. In one of them, Grace's face was clearly visible, leaning into my father's shoulder, whispering something in his ear as they walked into that room. That same room they stayed in for hours. I felt something inside me break. I didn't even realize I was shaking until I nearly dropped the phone. Every moment of our life together flashed through my head, warped, distorted. Every hug, every kiss, every time I'd shared something private with my father, it all felt like a lie. Tom delivered everything in one last package a couple of days later. I was barely holding myself together, sitting alone in my office, staring at the footage and photos he'd gathered. I watched them, knowing that nothing could ever take back what I'd seen. My wife, my father, people I'd loved, people I'd trusted beyond reason. I felt sick, but I kept watching, needing to understand, needing to know if there was any way this wasn't real. Tom didn't offer advice, just told me it was my choice what to do next. He'd done his job, and part of me was grateful that he hadn't tried to push me one way or another. But there I was, left with the shreds of my life, staring at the people I thought I knew and realizing I'd been nothing but a fool. I spent the rest of that night awake, just sitting in the dark, the weight of betrayal crushing down on me. I wanted to scream, to break everything in sight, but all I could do was sit there, replaying every detail of the past few days. I couldn't shake the image of them together, and every time I closed my eyes, it was like they were there, mocking me, daring me to confront them. What was I supposed to do? How could I face either of them, knowing what they'd done? The world I'd built, the trust one thought was unbreakable, had been shattered. And yet, somewhere in the depths of that anger and despair, I felt a flicker of something else, something cold and calculating. I wanted them to pay, not just to feel the betrayal I'd felt, but to understand the damage they'd caused. The next morning, I called Tom back, asking for his advice. He stayed quiet for a long moment before saying, "Jackson, this decision is yours. Just remember, whatever you do, there's no going back." His words hung in the air like a warning, but they didn't scare me. Not anymore. There's a moment after a betrayal like that where you think maybe it's all some kind of sick misunderstanding. I kept going back and forth in my head, wondering if there was some explanation, some excuse that would make this all go away. But I knew there wasn't. The evidence I'd seen, the lies she'd fed me, the look in my father's eyes in those videos, they haunted me, whispering that nothing I'd thought was real actually was. Still, I needed to confront Grace. Part of me thought that maybe if I gave her the chance to confess, it might feel less like my life was caving in around me. I picked a restaurant we used to love, a quiet place where we'd shared some of our best memories. I wanted to keep things calm, casual, like I was any other husband taking his wife out to dinner. She arrived a few minutes late, looking every bit the picture of innocence. She even flashed me that smile, the one I'd once believed meant she loved me. It made me sick to see her looking at me like that, knowing everything I knew. But I forced myself to smile back, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked her about her day, the usual small talk. Finally, I couldn't keep up the charade any longer. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low, and said, "Grace, I know about the affair." Her face changed instantly, like she'd been slapped. She blinked a few times, opening and closing her mouth, and then she gave me this nervous little laugh, like she thought it was some kind of joke. "What are you talking about, Jackson?" she said, forcing a smile. "There's no affair." I held her gaze, letting her see the resolve in my eyes. "I know, Grace. All of it. I know about you and Martin, and I know about you and my father." Her expression froze, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her composure. She didn't laugh this time. She just looked away, fiddling with her napkin as if it could somehow save her. But then she did what she always did, try to twist things, make it all seem like a misunderstanding. "Jackson," she said, her voice shaking just enough to make her sound innocent, "you have it all wrong. There's nothing going on. Martin's just a friend, and your father. Stop lying." I cut her off, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I've seen the videos, Grace. I know everything. Stop trying to play me." Her eyes widened, her face pale. For a moment, I thought she was going to break down, but then she just sat back, crossing her arms like some petulant child caught sneaking out. "Fine," she spat, her voice hardening. "But it's not what you think. It was just a moment of weakness. It doesn't mean anything." A moment of weakness? I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the quiet of the restaurant. A moment of weakness that lasted for how long? Grace? Weeks? Months? Just tell me the truth. But she wouldn't. She just sat there, refusing to look at me, clinging to her pride, or whatever excuse she thought could save her. I felt the last shred of my patience snap, and I stood up, throwing some bills on the table. "We're done here," I said, not waiting for her to respond. I couldn't stand to be near her, not for another second. After leaving, I drove straight to my parents' house. I needed answers, and there was only one person left to give them to me. My father was home when I arrived, and he looked surprised to see me standing there on his doorstep. He tried to greet me with a smile, but I wasn't here for pleasantries. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "We need to talk. Now." He looked down, avoiding my gaze like he was ashamed, but it was too late for that. "I don't know what to say, Jackson. It just happened. I was going through a rough time, a midlife crisis, or whatever they call it." He tried to laugh, but I cut him off. "A midlife crisis?" My voice shook with anger. "That's your excuse? You destroy our family because you were going through a rough time? Do you even hear yourself?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "How long?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" He looked away, his jaw clenched, and then he finally admitted, "A few months. It was never supposed to be serious. I didn't think it would hurt you like this." I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I felt. But all I could do was sit there, staring at the man who was supposed to be my father, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. "Why?" I asked again, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this to me?" He didn't have an answer. He just sat there, looking miserable, and all I felt was empty. This man, the man I'd looked up to my whole life, had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and he couldn't even tell me why. When I finally left, I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Everything I'd thought I knew, everything I'd believed in, had been destroyed. My wife, the woman I'd loved, had turned out to be nothing but a lie. And my father, the man I'd trusted more than anyone, had stabbed me in the back without a second thought. I went home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The walls, the furniture, the pictures of Grace and me, all of it felt wrong, like I was in some kind of twisted funhouse version of my life. I couldn't even look at our wedding photos without feeling sick. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of it all, but there was nothing to make sense of. Grace and my father had destroyed everything I'd believed in, and there was no going back. I knew I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep any connection with the people who'd betrayed me so deeply. After my confrontations with Grace and my father, I was hollowed out. But beneath the hurt, another feeling grew. I wanted them both to pay. Quietly moving on, pretending none of this had happened. That felt like letting them win. No, I needed something more than that. Something that would leave them as broken as they'd left me. I spent days thinking it over, weighing my options, imagining all the ways I could hurt them in return. And every time, I kept coming back to the same answer: exposure. They'd torn apart my world. Now it was their turn. I went over everything Tom had given me: videos, photos, recorded conversations. The damning evidence piled up, a twisted archive of betrayal I could barely look at without feeling sick. I knew posting it all online would be brutal. They'd lose everything: their reputations, their lives as they knew them. But at that point, I didn't care. I tried playing nice. I tried giving them a chance to explain themselves, and they'd thrown it back in my face. So I spent that evening creating an anonymous social media account, carefully preparing everything to go live. When I hit post, there was a surge of something cold and satisfying in my chest. Within hours, people were sharing the videos and photos, each one exposing a new layer of their lies. As the views and comments poured in, I watched from behind the screen, reading the shock and anger that others felt as they saw the truth. Grace's charity work was immediately called into question. Everything she'd built up as a do-gooder became a laughingstock. And my father, his respectable, steady image, the man everyone thought he was, that vanished. People were outraged. Grace and Henry were the new scandal, and I made sure every corner of the internet knew it. The fallout hit hard and fast. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines splashed across websites. Gossip columns ran with it. The people they'd surrounded themselves with, who'd once applauded their supposed goodness, were now pulling away, condemning them for what they'd done. Comments poured in, and people picked apart every detail. I knew it was harsh, but every word was a small victory, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. They'd hurt me deeply, but now they'd have to live with their actions. Grace was blindsided. I heard from friends that she was scrambling to set the record straight, telling anyone who would listen that it had all been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, that it didn't define who she was. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Her professional network dropped her like she was poison. No one wanted to be associated with her. Her friends, the ones who'd always supported her without question, cut her off. She'd had no problem isolating me in our relationship. Now, she was the one left isolated. Henry was no better off. I'd heard through family that his wife filed for divorce the very next day. His business partners, people he'd worked with for years, began pulling out, wanting nothing to do with the scandal. My father, the man who'd always seemed so untouchable, so certain of his place in the world, was now humiliated, brought down by his own selfish actions. For once, he was facing the consequences of his choices. The more I watched, the more I saw how deeply the fallout had spread. Grace's career was shattered. Her social circles vanished, and she was left clinging to whatever fragments of her reputation she could salvage, but there was nothing left to hold on to. Henry faced the same shame, the same social and professional exile. It was as if everything they'd once relied on to prop up their lives had collapsed, and they were left standing in the ruins they'd created. Part of me thought that revenge would give me closure, that seeing them suffer would somehow wash away the pain they'd caused. And in a way, it did. I felt a sense of justice, a dark satisfaction in knowing that they were finally facing the destruction they'd brought upon themselves. But once the dust settled, I was left with a strange, lingering emptiness. I'd achieved what I wanted. They'd lost everything, just as I had. But there was no undoing what they'd done, no repairing the damage they'd left in their wake. Even with the taste of revenge, a part of me still felt hollow, weighed down by everything that had come crashing down. The betrayal, the lies, the public spectacle, it all left a mark that went deeper than I'd expected. After exposing Grace and my father to the world, the next step was obvious. I needed to sever all ties with her. I wasn't sure what to expect when I told Grace I was filing for divorce. Honestly, I thought she might try to play it cool, maybe act like she was relieved it was finally over. But when I handed her the papers, the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't expecting me to go through with it. She thought, even after everything, that I'd just let her stay in my life. She was wrong. My lawyers moved quickly. The public exposure of her affair with my father had destroyed whatever leverage she thought she had. Grace tried to put up a fight, claiming all sorts of nonsense about how I'd been distant, how our marriage was already falling apart before her mistake. It was pathetic to watch her scramble, trying to make herself look like the victim. But it was no use. Her reputation was already in tatters, and the evidence was all over the internet for anyone to see. The courtroom was tense, every session like a pressure cooker about to explode. Grace's lawyer tried to spin it, to make it seem like I was the one who drove her to infidelity. But every time she opened her mouth, I just sat there calm, letting my lawyer do the talking. The judge, having already seen the evidence, didn't have much patience for her excuses. At one point, Grace tried to choke back tears, claiming that I'd neglected her, that she was just looking for comfort during a rough patch. But the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence was irrefutable. The videos, the photos, it was all laid bare. Finally, after weeks of drawn-out drama, the judge ruled in my favor. The divorce was finalized swiftly. No alimony, no settlement in her favor. Grace walked out of that courtroom with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever scraps of dignity she could muster. I felt a strange kind of relief. The marriage, the life we'd shared, it was all officially dead and buried. But there was still a heaviness in my chest that refused to go away. Grace, on the other hand, fell apart completely after the divorce. I heard through the grapevine that she was desperately trying to rebuild her life. She reached out to old friends, people who used to hang on her every word, but they all kept their distance. The scandal was too big, too public. No one wanted to be associated with someone who'd been so thoroughly exposed. She tried to pick up her charity work again, but no one would hire her. not after what had come out. Her social media accounts became ghost towns, filled with angry comments and people mocking her. I'd be lying if I said I didn't take some satisfaction in that. Eventually, she hit rock bottom. I heard she'd started seeing a therapist, trying to figure out why she'd done what she did, why she'd thrown everything away. But I couldn't bring myself to care. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. There were times when she'd try to reach out to me, sending long-winded emails filled with apologies, but I never responded. I was done with her. Let her drown in her own regrets. As for my father, Henry, he was facing his own nightmare. His wife, the woman who'd been by his side for decades, filed for divorce as soon as the story broke. She didn't even wait to hear his excuses. His business partners were next. Deals he'd spent years cultivating went up in smoke. The man who'd once been the center of our family was now a pariah, alone and disgraced. At one point, he tried to reach out to me. I got a message from him, saying he wanted to talk, to make things right. I couldn't even bring myself to respond. I didn't have the energy to pretend there was anything left to salvage between us. The man who'd betrayed me wasn't the father I grew up with. He was a stranger, and I didn't owe him anything. The divorce and the fallout from the scandal were exhausting. For a while, I was just going through the motions, trying to make it through each day. I moved out of the house we'd shared. Every room was filled with memories that made my stomach turn. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, somewhere that didn't have her fingerprints all over it. It was strange, starting over at my age, like being thrown into the deep end of a pool when you've forgotten how to swim. I poured myself into my work, trying to drown out the noise in my head. The anger, the bitterness, they didn't disappear overnight, but they dulled over time. Friends I hadn't seen in years started reaching out. At first, I was hesitant. I'd cut myself off from so many people during my marriage, letting Grace be the center of my world. But now, with her gone, I realized how much I'd missed those connections. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was walking around in a fog, wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. But I kept moving forward one step at a time. I took up running again, something I hadn't done in years. It helped clear my mind, helped me focus on something other than the wreckage of my past. Slowly, I started to find myself again. The man I'd been before Grace came into my life, before I'd let myself become so wrapped up in her that I couldn't see the signs. I began to see that there was more to life than the betrayal and the pain. There were people who cared about me, who'd stuck by me even when I'd been too blind to see it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel hope again. The day the divorce was finalized, I knew I needed to leave the city. Every corner held memories of Grace, and I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, left behind everything that reminded me of her, and moved to a small town where no one knew me. It was strange living alone again. The silence was jarring at first, but over time, I found comfort in it. I focused on myself, something I hadn't done in years. I started working out, reading, and even traveled a bit. It was like I was learning to breathe again. In those months, I realized how much of myself I'd lost during my marriage. The solitude was healing. I began to reach out to old friends I'd neglected. To my surprise, they welcomed me back, no questions asked. I'd push them away while trying to make things work with Grace, and they never held it against me. They just listened, which was exactly what I needed. During one of my trips, I ran into Claire, an old acquaintance from university. We weren't close back then, but now there was an instant connection. We started meeting up, no expectations, just enjoying each other's company. As we spent more time together, something deeper developed. Claire was everything Grace wasn't: kind, honest, and patient. For the first time, I could just be myself without fear. I was careful not to rush things. The wounds from Grace's betrayal were still fresh, and I wasn't sure if I could trust anyone again. But Claire was patient, never pushed for more than I was ready to give. She was there for me in a way I didn't even know I needed. Slowly, I started to believe in the possibility of something real again. Around that time, I received another email from Grace. It was filled with apologies, saying she was trying to rebuild her life, working at a cafe. She begged for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I'd moved on. I didn't owe her anything. She'd made her choices, and I was done paying for them. With Claire, things felt different. We weren't perfect, and I still had moments of doubt. But she never judged me. She listened, and with her I felt safe. One night, as we watched the city lights from her balcony, she told me, "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Jackson." For the first time, I believed her. I realized the betrayal didn't define me. It was just a chapter one had to close. As our relationship grew, I found a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about replacing what I'd lost, but discovering a life where I could truly be happy. Claire was part of that journey, but it was also about learning to trust myself again. Grace is still out there somewhere, trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. My father is alone, dealing with the consequences of his choices. But that's not my burden anymore. I'm focused on the future, on building something real with Claire. I'm no longer that broken man who discovered the affair. I've finally moved past the anger and bitterness. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that's more than enough.